Simon watched in utter awe as the shadows on the wall began to move in a way that defied the static light of his torch. The amber glow from the sphere projected a fluid, shifting map onto the cave walls. Welcome to the Purely Fiction Society. I'm Knowles, your host, and tonight we journey into the misty canyons of Mpumalanga, South Africa. A landscape of towering red cliffs, roaring waterfalls, and deep churning waters that have carved strange secrets into the rock over millennia. Join me as we follow a man obsessed with a legend who learns that some ancient treasures are guarded by forces older than memory itself. This is the Canyon of the Ancestors. The Blyde River Canyon is a place where the earth seems to have split open just to show its teeth. By day, tourists crowd the wooden bridges at Burke's Potholes, snapping photos of the deep cylindrical shafts bored into the bedrock by centuries of swirling river water. They toss tiny, shiny coins into the dark pools, making wishes, completely unaware of what lies beneath the foam. But by dusk, the tourists have left. The mist rolls in from the Drakensberg escarpment, heavy and cold, swallowing the red sandstone cliffs and turning the roaring waters into a low, echoing rumble. Dr. Simon Preston stood on the edge of the highest canyon, his canvas jacket damp from the spray. He was an archaeologist who had spent the better part of 2 decades tracking different versions of the stories passed down through history that the academic world dismissed as mere folklore. Specifically, he was looking for the lost treasure of the local tribes, a collection of sacred ivory, iron, and copper ritual artifacts that vanished completely during the chaotic wars of early 1800s. For 2 centuries, historians believed the treasure had been looted and some melted down. But Simon had found an entry in a discarded, faded journal by a 19th century prospector named Tom Burke. The journal entry didn't mention gold mines. It mentioned a deep subterranean vault hidden beneath the churning violent whirlpools where the Trier and the Blyde rivers meet. Simon adjusted the heavy straps of his backpack, checking the secure buckles of his climbing harness and the thick waterproof casing of his high-powered torches. He wasn't here to dig in the dirt. He was here to go where the water had spent 200 years hiding the truth. Leaving the paved tourist pathway behind him, Simon used the cover of gathering fog to slip past the restricted iron gates. The sandstone ground beneath his boots was slick and treacherous. He scrambled down a steep, narrow crevice in the gorge wall, moving entirely by memory and the dim ambient light of the Mpumalanga night. As he descended deeper into the canyon, the sound of the water changed from a distant roar to a deafening rhythmic thrum. It felt less like a river and more like a massive living machine operating deep within the stone. At the bottom of the gorge, the air was freezing and thick with river mist. Simon stood on a narrow ledge just inches away from one of the largest potholes, a massive smooth-walled stone cylinder, 20 feet wide and dropping straight down into a boiling vortex of dark water. During the dry winter season, the water levels dropped just enough to expose the lower ridges of the potholes. Simon shone his torch down into the abyss. The beam cut through the rising steam, illuminating the perfectly circular walls of the shaft. 50 feet down, where the water swirled into an underground drainage channel, he saw it. A dark rectangular opening was carved cleanly into the side of the cylindrical rock wall. It was completely hidden from above, visible only to someone hanging directly over the churning water. It was an impossible piece of engineering for a natural river system. Simon secured his heavy-duty climbing rope to a deep, solid iron anchor point. he had drilled into the limestone rock face the previous week. He snapped his descender onto the rope, took a deep steadying breath, and stepped off the ledge into the empty air of the pothole. The descent was brutal. The freezing spray from the river lashed at his face, blinding him as he spun slowly on the rope. The smooth cylindrical walls of the pothole rushed past him, worn down to a marble-like finish by millions of tons of swirling gravel over thousands of years. The roar of the water inside the enclosed stone chamber was absolute, vibrating through his teeth and chest. With a heavy thud, Simon swung his boots inward, landing squarely on the wet, slippery threshold of the hidden rectangular opening. He unhooked his harness, keeping the safety rope attached to his belt, and scrambled into the dark tunnel. The moment he stepped past the threshold, the deafening roar of the river suddenly died down, replaced by a strange, heavy silence. The air here didn't smell like river mud. It smelled dry, ancient, and faintly of old wood and burnt resin. Simon wiped the water from his eyes and clicked on his backup light. The tunnel sloped gently upwards, leading away from the riverbed and deeper into the heart of the sandstone cliff. The walls here were different. They weren't smooth like the pothole. They were covered in jagged, hand-chiseled marks, showing that men had carved this passage out of the mountain with crude tools centuries ago. Simon moved cautiously, his boots making soft, echoing sounds against the dry stone floor. The passage twisted twice before opening into a vast, cavernous room hidden deep beneath the Mpumalanga hills. Simon stopped dead in his tracks, his flashlight beam trembling slightly as he swept it across the space. The chamber was a sacred vault. Lining the walls were rows of ancient hand-woven clay vessels, completely preserved by dry cavern air. In the center of the room sat a massive wooden platform, constructed from weathered African ironwood that had resisted rot for 200 years. Stacked carefully upon the platform was the lost tribal treasure. There were massive, intricately carved elephant ivory tusks, heavy ceremonial copper rings used for status and trade, and beautifully preserved iron spears with blades etched with lineage marks. These weren't mere commodities. They were the sacred historical soul of a people hidden away from colonial raiders and prospectors to ensure they would never be desecrated. But it was what sat in the very center of the hoard that made Simon's breath catch in his throat. Resting on a raised stone pedestal was a singular artifact unlike anything he had ever seen. It was a solid, polished sphere made of a dark, iridescent mineral that seemed to absorb the light of his flashlight. Woven around the sphere was an intricate network of fine, hand-beaten copper wire, holding the stone in place like a delicate cage. As Simon approached the pedestal, he realized the air in the room was growing noticeably warmer. The closer he got to the dark sphere, the more the silence of the cave began to change. It wasn't a sound at all, but a sensation, a faint rhythmic pulsing that vibrated through the soles of his boots. It perfectly matched the steady, heavy thrum of the rivers outside, but it felt deliberate and controlled. Simon reached into his pack and pulled out his camera, carefully documenting the placement of the artifacts, the preservation of the wood, and the geometric layout of the room. He knew this discovery would change African archaeology forever, but the obsession that had driven him for 20 years pulled him closer to the central pedestal. He set his camera down and stretched out a gloved hand towards the iridescent sphere. The moment his fingers brushed against the copper wire casing, a sharp, harmless shock of static electricity snapped against his hand. Simon gasped, taking a step back. The dark sphere didn't move, but the fine copper wires began to glow with a faint, warm amber luminescence. The repetitive geometric patterns carved into the stone pedestal beneath it suddenly lit up, casting long, intricate shadows along the cavern walls. The low, rhythmic thrumming in the room intensified, shifting from a subtle vibration into a deep, resonant hum that echoed off the high sandstone ceiling. Simon watched in utter awe as the shadows on the wall began to move in a way that defied the static light of his torch. The amber glow from the sphere projected a fluid, shifting map onto the cave walls. It showed the ancient topography of the Blyde River Canyon, tracing the flow of water as it had moved through the landscape 2 centuries ago. The fantasy of the old legends wasn't a myth. The artifact was a key, an ancient repository of knowledge and geography kept alive by the very energy of the earth itself. The tribes hadn't just had their sacred ivory and copper here. They had bound their history into a living stone. Simon didn't waste another second. He grabbed his camera, checking to ensure the digital photos of the murals and the artifacts were secure. He sprinted back down the dark hand-chiseled tunnel, the air growing colder and damper as he neared the riverbed. He reached the rectangular opening just as the river outside gave a massive surge. The water in the pothole was rising, swirling in a violent white foam vortex just 3 feet below the ledge. Simon snapped his descender back onto the climbing rope, gripped the line with his gloved hands, and engaged his mechanical ascender. Using every ounce of physical strength left in his body, he hauled himself up the vertical shaft of the pothole, fighting against the heavy freezing spray of the rising water. His boots scrambled for purchase against the smooth marble-like walls of the cylinder until his hand finally reached the top iron anchor point. With a final desperate heave, Simon pulled himself over the edge of the gorge, collapsing onto the wet sandstone of the upper canyon walkway. He lay there for a moment, gasping for breath. The freezing mist washed over his face as the roaring rivers continued their eternal dance below him. By midnight, Simon was back at his jeep, parked on a lonely dirt overlook high above the Blyde River Canyon. He sat in the driver's seat, the heater running, looking at the glowing screen of his camera. The high-resolution images clearly showed the rows of clay vessels, the gold armbands, and the mysterious iridescent sphere. The world would eventually know that the lost tribal treasures were real. He had the definite archaeological proof to rewrite the history books, but the entrance to the vault would remain his secret alone. The Burke potholes would continue to churn their wild, violent waters, guarding the ancient legacy buried deep within the Mpumalanga stone, just as the ancestors had intended. The earth does not surrender its secrets easily, and some treasures are far more valuable left in the dark. Dr. Simon Preston returned from the canyon with his proof, but the heart of the mountain remains untouched, listening to the eternal rhythm of the water. Thank you for listening to tonight's journey with the Purely Fiction Society. Until next time, keep searching for the dark corners of the map, but tread carefully. Good night.